right, so we're skipping through the intro. We're going straight into part 2 of our Know Your Lore episode on Crossgen Comics. We've talked the first setup of the first half. Mark Alessi gets his $44 million by selling his company to Perot Systems, takes that $44 million, forms this comic book company, hires everyone on staff. There's some freelancers still, but he hires the majority of people on staff and starts putting out books that are kind of shaking up the industry. They're really good books. They are starting to get traction, but they're getting a lot of pushback from the majors due to the way that they're hiring people and not paying them by contract. And then more things started to come into play that caused the entirety of Crossgen's empire to crumble. And that's what we're going to get into this episode. A few things came to head all at once. Crossgen was publishing far too many books. We're talking in their first few years, they were up to like 15 books, guys. And they refused to cancel poor performers when they should. A lot of times we get upset as comic fans when they cancel books by a publisher. The reason is they're not selling. They got to do it, man. If the books aren't selling, you got to cancel them. You can't just put out books to put them out there. Have to make money in order to keep making books. And so these poor performers, they weren't canceling at Crossgen. Every book, it's typical for them to bleed readers every month, right? So you start a book, you start number 1, you get this huge audience, and then over time, each month, you start to bleed readers, and that readership starts to dwindle, and then you hit that threshold of, okay, this is no longer profitable. It's at this point your majors will cancel a book. And then what do? They relaunch it with another number 1. Why? Because number 1s generate interest, and they generate sales, and they boomerang you back to this high period again, and then you start going through the bleed as you bleed. And that's why we go through this cycle in comics all the time. They refused to do that at Crossgen. They wanted to keep putting these books out. They didn't do anything to stop the bleed. They didn't do anything to address it and to try to get more readers. And so they were publishing books that just were not making money. A few of their books were doing fine. I think Ruse was doing well. I think Meridian was more than profitable. Sojourn was more than profitable. But you're talking that's like 3 to 4 out of 15 that weren't making money. That's when they didn't need to be up to 15 books, but if they were going to get up to 15, they really needed to start canceling those when they hit that threshold of not being profitable. The other thing you can do when you're trying to shake up a book to get people interested is to put on a new creative team, right? Oh, look, Donny Cates and Ryan Stegman are coming over to Thor from Venom. They couldn't do that at Crossgen because a lot of them were employed. So while it's a good idea, right, it's a benefit to offer your staff this employment, it also becomes a bad idea because you can't cut a contract now and move on. These are your employees. If you're employing George Perez for what you're paying George Perez better be drawing something, right? It's sad that they put him on Solus, which was a terrible project, but you can't just have him sitting there not doing anything. You can't cut his contract. Cutting his contract as an employee is just straight up firing him. And that doesn't look good in the industry, and that doesn't get people to want to sign with you as a freelancer or an employee. So they're kind of stuck in this weird area because they didn't address this bleed by canceling books, rebooting them, etc. And then one of the other things is the big picture failed, right? Crossgen had this idea called the big picture. The big picture is what tied all their titles together. So if you look at the first, all the first Crossgen titles, you'll see all the characters has a sigil on them, right? A symbol. These sigil bearers played heavily into this big picture. This sigil gave them all powers that other people didn't have and things of that nature. The big picture started to mean that you had to read all the books to fill in the loop, right? By the time Crossgen published Solus, the book I talked about with George Perez, the big picture had become a detriment. The Solus was a book all about the big picture, and you needed to know all of these things about. It was real fan service for only the most hardcore Crossgen fans. So when you're talking the most hardcore fans of a company that barely maybe is trying to get to 5% of the market, but probably is closer to half of a percentage total, you're talking a very small group of people, and they're not people that can sustain what you're doing. And even those people didn't want to buy into the book. The majority of them, right? Solus from the first issue to the second issue lost 7,000 readers in one issue. That's huge. That's huge in that time of comics at the level that those books were being published at, right? You're talking like 20-some thousand copies. All of a sudden you're down to 13. That's not a slow bleed like we talked about. That's a hemorrhage at that point. You cannot sustain with that being your model and the way that you're doing business. So the big picture failed in that regard. They made it was a cool concept, but they made it so important for you to have to be locked into these other things. And I can tell you as a fan of CrossGen, it sucked because I didn't like books like Negation. I didn't like Mystic necessarily, but I kind of felt like I had to read these books to stay in on the big picture. I liked Sojourn. I liked Meridian. I loved Route 66. I loved Ruse. I didn't even need them crossing over. And I didn't need there to be a big picture for them. Like, I just needed to read really good comics, and that was it. Another thing CrossGen did, they really embraced big bookstores trying to sell their trade paperbacks. They created whole displays for them to put in your Barnes and Noble and comic book stores, etc. Comic books have never done the best in big box stores. Marvel kind of fell for this too at one point and thought they'd be a great avenue to start putting their books in Borders. And if you remember the early 2000s, you remember Borders. When's the last time anyone's seen a Borders? And Barnes and Noble certainly isn't as popular as it was then. And what you started to see is when these comics, these trade paperbacks weren't selling at Barnes and Noble, Borders, etc., what happened? They sent them back to CrossGen for a return. Hey man, your product's not selling. We need our money back. You can sit on this shit. We're not going to. That created a huge bill that CrossGen suddenly had to pay. All of these things start to add up. All of these things together as we're getting into the 2000s really start to add up. Then there's the accusations of favoritism and lack of payment. So while CrossGen had a core of employed staff, they also had others who could be freelancers. There's rumors that the employed staff were treated with a high degree of favoritism, and then there were claims for lack of payment for some of the freelancers that were working out there. And that started to happen in the 2000s. Up until that point, everyone was getting paid, right? Up until right around 2003, everyone was getting paid just fine. So let me be clear about that. And then they started to fall into some issues in mid to late 2003 from what I've read. CrossGen started to default in some other payments. One of the publishers refused to print their books, Quebecor. They just said, we're not printing your shit. You guys aren't paying your bills, we're not printing it. CrossGen had to come out and promise, publicly to fans, right? Hey, we're gonna pay everyone, don't worry. October 2003, all the bills will be paid, books will be clean, don't worry about it. They did not make that deadline. And I really do believe Alessi tried, right? But to top it off, the money backing the company, remember that $44 million? Perot Systems was implicated in some shenanigan scheme, and their stock price plummeted. And all of a sudden, Alessi's $44 million worth of stock that he was going to use to finance this empire suddenly wasn't worth $44 million. So now, you're not selling books, you're bleeding money, you're failing to pay people. You can all see how this is adding up, right? None of these things, when I say them, makes you think, oh, they turned it around and made it a huge success. They're all just kind of like death by 1,000 cuts. And that's essentially what happened to the company. Alessi tried his hardest. He sold a lot of his personal wealth. He sold his Fantastic Four #1. He took out a loan for $75K just to keep the company afloat, like a personal loan. So I think he really did try. But in the midst of all this, his wife also died of a heart attack, like out of nowhere. And suddenly Alessi's a parent, single parent, 13-year-old kid. My finances are plummeting. My business this is what it is. Everything he turned to, he really tried to make this Hollywood avenue work. The business was actually designed to fail the first 6 years and then start making money off of film and TV licensing. He actually changed the name in 2003 with that idea to CrossGen Entertainment from Crossgen Comics. So he had a lot of deals. Apparently there was a huge deal at DreamWorks for The Way of the Rat book that something happened with Spielberg and the project never got greenlit. It got greenlit by everyone but Spielberg. And I think up until Alessi died, he was really upset about that, if you go look up the quotes. In June of 2004, Alessi notified all the staff left that CrossGen was shutting down. Disney, who had been looking at some licensing for CrossGen Works, they just went out and instead bought every asset from the company for $1 million, period, right? And they were really only doing that for their what's it, a Badazad comic they wanted to try to make into a show. They put out some books a few years after the purchase, kind of like children's books kind of things, and they failed. And so they've had this property sitting there for $1 million. And then what happens? Eventually Disney also buys Marvel. So now their comic stream, right, Crossgen gets folded up under Marvel, all that property. They don't need two comic companies under Disney. They got one, the biggest one. So one regret that Alessi has stated was that they were never able to prove they were better than Marvel at Crossgen, which is ironic because now Marvel owns Crossgen. And so that's your brief history of Crossgen Comics. We didn't touch on Alessi as a person. He's died in 2019. I don't know how fair that is to really speak on things that weren't necessarily documented for sure and are a lot of hearsay from other people. There's some ex-Crossgen staff with some pretty unflattering opinions of him. When Crossgen actually folded, one of them sent him a black wreath with a note on the top that said, "Wouldn't your dead wife be proud of you?" I'm not going to say who it was. That's a huge move, though. You got to have some real hate to go that far with someone. But overall, Crossgen gave us some great comic books. If you see them out there, like I said, they're easy to acquire. It's unfortunate that things ended for them the way they did. I started this project to look back at them, like I said, due to Marvel putting out a trade paperback that's going to reprint a lot of the first issues, 4 of the first issues from some of the Crossgen books. They're all good stories. It's probably going to be a reasonable price. And the other thing they're doing this for, like, just so you guys know, the reason Marvel's doing this, I don't think they're really doing it because they have huge plans for Crossgen necessarily, but in order to keep the rights to Crossgen, they have to publish something every like 5 years typically, right? And so if they don't publish something, then those rights go up for grabs or revert back to someone somewhere along the line that own them. There's probably 20 people that touch this in between all this bankruptcy and everything else. And so what they're doing is putting this book out to say, we published something Crossgen, so now we get to keep the rights to it. But my hope is that they'll actually revisit this content. My hope is that we'll actually see a Sojourn or a Meridian or a Ruse comic on the shelves again someday. But like I said, you can find the issues on eBay. You can find the trades on eBay. You can find this trade from Marvel when it comes out in November. So that's it for this recap of Crossgen Comics, guys. Thanks for tuning in for another episode of Know Your Lore. Now you know a little bit more about the history of one of these companies that creates the comics that we love so much. Thanks for watching. Remember to hit like, remember to hit subscribe, and I'll see you next time.